Welcome back to the deep dive. Our mission today is to give you a complete shortcut to expertise, and we are diving deep into probably the most fundamental and complex structure in human anatomy, the skull.
It really is.
Specifically, we're navigating Chapter 34 of Gray's Anatomy, and here's the challenge. We're relying solely on your imagination. We are tackling this massive bony structure without a single visual aid.
It's a great challenge. When you think of the skull, you have to think of protection. It is this architecturally complex casing that achieves three really critical things.
Okay.
It houses the brain, that's the neurocranium. It contains the organs of special sense, and it provides this robust gateway for the upper respiratory and digestive tracts.
And that part is the viscerocranium, right? The
The-
facial skeleton.
Exactly, the viscerocranium. And then when we refer to the whole skull, we are talking about more than just that top dome. The neurocranium itself is made up of the calvaria, the skull cap, and the basicranium, which is the crucial cranial base. And then below that, you have the facial skeleton and the mandible, that one independent bone.
And structurally, it is a fortress. I mean, movement is almost non-existent for most of these bones.
Oh, highly restricted. When you move your head to nod, you're using the atlanto-occipital joint. And when you chew or talk, that's the temporomandibular joint, the TMJ.
And that's pretty much it.
That's it. Everything else is basically stitched together for rigidity. So, okay, let's unpack this, maybe starting with the building blocks, because how these bones are formed really explains their function.
Tell us about that, because they're two different sort of creation stories for the skull bones.
It's a fascinating dual origin.
Hmm.
So the bones of the cranial base, the basicranium, they mostly develop through endochondral ossification.
Meaning they start as cartilage first?
Exactly. They start as cartilage and then turn to bone. That forms what we call the chondrocranium, but the big flat bones of the vault that cover the brain, they develop via intramembranous ossification. So bone forming directly in membranes.
And that distinction is so important because it directly affects the architecture of the skull cap. These vault bones, they aren't solid blocks, they're actually engineered for impact. How should we visualize that?
Visualize a protective sandwich. That's the best way. You have two dense plates, or tables, of compact bone, an outer table and an inner table.
Okay.
And squeezed between them is a narrow, spongy layer called the diploë. It's essentially cancellous bone, but it's very, very vascular.
And here's where it gets really important clinically. Those two tables are not structurally equal.
Not at all. That's a critical point. The outer table is thicker, it's more resilient, it can handle more direct, blunt force. But the inner table, the one right up against the brain and the meninges, is much thinner and more brittle.
So in a bad accident.
In a severe trauma, the outer table might deform or crack, but the inner table is much more likely to just shatter. And that can cause depressed fractures and potentially tear the dura or an artery. Surgeons actually use this difference when they do cranial bone grafting. They can carefully split the tables.
So moving from the bone itself to how the parts connect. We're talking about sutures, mostly. How does the body make these seem strong, but still, allow for a growing brain?
Well, the sutures are fibrous joints, and they allow for a bit of give during development. We categorize them based on how they interlock, which usually reflects the kind of strain they're under.
Okay, so what are the types?
The simplest are just simple, or butt-end sutures. The bones just meet flush. Think of the median palatine suture on the roof of your mouth.
Then you have the bevelled joints, where one bone kind of overlaps the other, which I assume makes it stronger.
Precisely, like the parieto-temporal suture along the side of your head. And then for the most mechanical stress, you have the serrated sutures. That's the classic interlocking jigsaw puzzle look.
Like the lambdoid suture at the back.
Exactly like the lambdoid.
And these eventually fuse solid. It's a process called synostosis. What's the most critical fusion point for, say, overall skull growth in a kid?
While the vault sutures start fusing in adulthood, the absolute key to growth in childhood is a primary cartilaginous joint at the base, the spheno-occipital synchondrosis.
That's a mouthful.
It is, but it's so important. It's between the sphenoid and occipital bones, and it drives the whole skull base forward as it grows. Its fusion is super consistent, usually between 13 and 18 years. That makes it an incredibly reliable marker for estimating age.
Okay, so we've got the internal architecture. Now let's orient the listener externally. Let's imagine we are looking at a skull from the frontal view. What are the key landmarks we should be picturing?
The shape is generally ovoid, and it's noticeably wider up top. The forehead is dominated by the frontal bone. If you trace down to the root of your nose, you find the nation, where the frontal and nasal bones meet.
And above the eyes?
Above your eyes, you have the superciliary arches, which are often more prominent in males, and between them is that little median elevation called the glabella.
And below that, the orbits really define the middle of the face. The upper margin is the frontal bone, and it has that little supraorbital notch or foramen. Why is that opening so important?
Because that's the exit for the supraorbital nerve and vessels. That's what gives you sensation and blood supply to your forehead. Then below the orbits, you have the paired maxillae forming the upper jaw, and they create the borders of that pear-shaped anterior nasal aperture.
And there's a really useful trick for visualizing three keyholes or foramina on the face.
Yes, the suborbital, the infraorbital, and the mental foramina, they often line up in the same vertical plane. They're all transmitting branches of the trigeminal nerve and key vessels.
So that alignment helps clinicians if they're trying to do a nerve block.
Exactly. It's a great landmark for targeted regional anesthesia.
Okay, let's pivot to the back, the posterior or occipital view. What's defining this region?
This is mainly the parietal, temporal, and the big occipital bone. Up top, you find the lambda, which is the junction between the lambdoid and sagittal sutures.
And in the middle?
In the midline of the occipital bone, you have that prominent bump, the inion, or the external occipital protuberance.
And that lump isn't just a lump, right? It's for muscle attachments.
Absolutely. Running sideways from the inion are the superior and inferior nuchal lines. These are powerful ridges where the big extensor muscles of the neck attach. It's what lets you lift and hold your head up.
Okay, now for the lateral view, the side of the head. This brings us to one of the most clinically high-stakes locations in the entire skull, the pterion.
Ah, the pterion.
Yeah.
It's that H-shaped junction where four bones all come together. The frontal, parietal, sphenoid, and temporal. You can actually feel it on yourself. It's that thin spot on your temple, just behind your eye socket.
And why is this specific junction so precarious?
Because lying immediately deep to this very thin area of bone is the anterior branch of the middle meningeal artery.
So a blow to the side of the head.
A blow right to the pterion is incredibly dangerous. A fracture there can easily tear that artery, which leads very quickly to an epidural hematoma, a severe intracranial bleed.
That is definitely a point to remember. What are the other key landmarks on the side?
Well, you have the zygomatic archer cheekbone. Inferiorly, the mandible with its big ascending ramus. The coronoid process is an important spike for the temporalis muscle to attach to, and the condylar process forms the joint for the TMJ.
And behind the ear?
The mastoid process. That blunt projection is the attachment for your big sternocleidomastoid muscle. We also identify the asterion here, which is the meeting point of three sutures, another key surgical landmark.
We've seen the rigid exterior. Now let's go inside. If we were to lift the calvaria off, we're looking down into the cranial base, which is, it's not a flat floor. It's more like a series of descending steps.
That's the perfect way to visualize it. Three distinct levels.
Yeah.
The anterior cranial fossa, which is the highest, then you step down to the middle cranial fossa, and finally you drop into the posterior cranial fossa, the lowest and deepest one.
Let's start at the top, the anterior cranial fossa. What are we supporting here, and what makes up its floor?
This highest step supports the frontal lobes of the brain. The floor is mostly the orbital plate of the frontal bone, but right in the center, part of the ethmoid bone, you find the crista galli.
The rooster's comb.
Right. It's a small ridge that provides a vital attachment point for the falx cerebri, which is the dural partition that separates the two cerebral hemispheres.
And on either side of that ridge is a very recognizable structure, just full of little holes.
The cribriform plate. It's perforated like a sieve, and for a very good reason. It allows all the tiny olfactory nerve filaments, your nerves of smell, to pass directly from the nasal mucosa up into the brain to reach the olfactory bulb.
Okay, moving down the slope, we hit the middle cranial fossa. This is supporting the temporal lobes, and it's really defined by the sphenoid and temporal bones and contains that famous bony saddle.
The sella turcica, which literally means Turkish saddle. This deep depression is where the crucial pituitary gland sits. It's bounded by the anterior and posterior clanoid processes, which act as anchor points for the dura.
And just in front of the sella turcica is the channel that's absolutely critical for vision.
That's the optic canal. It's the conduit for the optic nerve and the ophthalmic artery. Immediately next to it, separated by a little bony strut, is the much bigger superior orbital fissure.
And that's for all the nerves that move the eye.
Exactly, and provide sensation.
And as we sweep out laterally across the sphenoid, we find that critical cluster of three foramina, often called a crescent. This is the expressway for the trigeminal nerve branches.
It's the communication hub down to the infratemporal fossa. So, starting medially, you find the foramen rotundum for the maxillary nerve. Move back a bit, and you hit the larger oval-shaped foramen ovale for the mandibular nerve.
And
And finally, the tiny little foramen spinosum, which transmits the middle meningeal artery.
So we mentioned its vulnerability near the pterion outside, and here's where it enters on the inside. But we have to clarify the function of the foramen lacerum. It's a confusing one.
It is a classic point of confusion. Despite its name, the foramen lacerum is usually not a true passage for anything major going completely through the skull. It's a jagged gap at the skull base that's mostly filled with fibrocartilage.
So nothing goes through it.
Not really. The internal carotid artery does run right over its upper edge as it enters the middle fossa, but it doesn't pass through.
Okay, dropping to the deepest step, the posterior cranial fossa. This houses the brainstem, the pons and medulla, and the cerebellum. The sloping surface leading down to it is the clivus.
Right, the clivus is formed by the fused sphenoid and occipital bones. It's clinically important because it's a site for some really nasty tumors like chordomas, and sitting right in the middle of this fossa is the single largest opening in the entire cranial base.
The foramen magnum, the great hole. And it really lives up to the name. It transmits the continuation of the brainstem as it becomes the spinal cord.
Along with the vertebral arteries and the accessory nerves. Flanking that massive opening are the two oval convex surfaces, the occipital condyles. These are what articulate with the first cervical vertebra, the atlas.
And just deep to those condyles, there's a channel for the nerve that controls the tongue.
The hypoglossal canal, yes. It transmits the hypoglossal nerve, cranial nerve 12. And finally, out to the side of the condyles is the massively important and often asymmetric jugular foramen.
Tell us why that asymmetry matters. It's not just an exit for three crucial cranial nerves.
It's primarily a venous conduit. The jugular foramen is the main pathway for the huge internal jugular vein to drain all the blood from the brain. The asymmetry is key because the right jugular foramen is often significantly larger than the left.
Why is that?
It just reflects a tendency for the major venous sinuses inside the brain to drain preferentially down the right side.
Now that we've built the adult framework, let's talk about how dynamic the skull is across a lifespan. We have to discuss the neonatal skull.
Oh, the contrast is just dramatic. At birth, the face is tiny, about 1/8 the size of the adult face, and the calvaria is disproportionately huge. But the key difference is the existence of the fontanelles,
The soft spots.
the soft spots where ossification is incomplete.
And how many are there? Which one is the most important clinically?
There are typically 6. The most prominent is the big rhomboid anterior fontanelle at the junction of the coronal and sagittal sutures. This is the last to close, usually around 18 months, and its tension is so important for assessing intracranial pressure in an infant.
And the one at the back.
The smaller triangular posterior fontanelle closes much, much earlier, usually within the first 2 or 3 months.
We established that the sutures are designed to allow for growth. So what happens when that system fails, when they close too early?
That's a condition called craniosynostosis premature fusion. Because growth is restricted perpendicular to whichever suture fuses, the skull is forced to compensate by growing in other directions, leading to some severe deformities.
For example,
If the sagittal suture fuses too early, you get a long, narrow, boat-shaped vault called scaphocephaly. If one of the coronal sutures fuses prematurely, you get plagiocephaly, which is an asymmetrical, twisted-looking face.
the skull remains one of the most powerful tools in forensic science long after everything else is gone. How does this structure help establish an identity?
Oh, the skull is paramount for estimating a biological identity, especially sex and age. Sex estimation relies on robusticity. So male skulls typically have more pronounced muscle attachments, larger mastoid processes, more defined supraorbital ridges, and squarer chins.
And while estimating an adult's age from suture fusion is, notoriously inaccurate, what's the most reliable age estimator involving the skull?
Dental maturation, hands down. The predictable patterns of tooth development, mineralization, and eruption are highly correlated with chronological age. They're much less susceptible to environmental factors than the rest of the skeleton.
And all that anatomical knowledge feeds directly into estimating what someone looked like.
Yes, through forensic facial reconstruction. This is where artists and anthropologists apply soft tissue depth averages to the bony contours of the skull, and they combine that with interpreting muscle attachment sites to estimate facial features and overall appearance, just from the bone alone.
We have covered a tremendous amount of ground today, navigating the skull just with audio. We covered the dual origins of the bone, that protective sandwich of the diploë, located critical external landmarks like the pterion, and then descended through the three complex terraces of the cranial fossae, identifying every critical exit point from the cribriform plate to the jugular foramen.
And the key takeaway should be that every opening, every ridge, every variation in the skull serves a purpose for either protection or communication. The seemingly passive structure of the skull dictates the exit points for nearly every major neurological and vascular structure connecting the brain to the body. And this raises an important question for you to think about. Knowing the precise location of major arteries, like the middle meningeal and the internal carotid, relative to the thin bone of the calcarean and the dense bone of the sola turcica, how do you think surgeons use these bony limitations to plan access routes for complex cranial surgery, all while prioritizing safety and efficiency?
An excellent thought to chew on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the architecture of the skull. We'll catch you next time.